Picture this. Complete, suffocating darkness is covering the entire state of Brighton. Imagine you're standing right outside the royal castle. The cold wind is literally biting at your face, when suddenly, that heavy, dead silence is completely shattered. You hear the terrifying sound of horses approaching at a breakneck, desperate speed. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive into the absolute darkest hour in Brighton's history. Moments after those hoofbeats echoed through the night, wounded soldiers came stumbling out of the darkness from the direction of Shadowpine Forest. And guys, their armor wasn't just broken, it was torn apart. Deep, violent wounds covered their bodies. But what was truly unsettling wasn't the blood. No, it was the look in their eyes. The sheer fear carved into their faces looked far worse than the injuries themselves. It was that kind of absolute paralyzing terror that only comes from witnessing something truly evil. As soon as they reached the palace gates, they just collapsed onto the cold stone ground.
The royal guards rushed forward in an absolute panic, carrying these broken men inside the castle and straight to the royal physician. Hours passed in agonizing tension as the physician desperately tried to treat them. Finally, one of the soldiers slowly regained consciousness. But he didn't ask for water. He didn't even ask about his wounds. He grabbed the physician's arm with a vice-like grip, and in a breathless, terrified whisper, he delivered a chilling message. "We need to see the king, immediately. It's about Prince Jackson."
Now, what's truly terrifying is the physical evidence they brought back with them. When the physician actually examined the soldiers, he became deeply disturbed. These were not normal battle wounds. Deep slash marks covered their hands, sure, but the skin around these wounds had turned dark, a necrotic black. It was almost as if some unseen, cursed energy was actively spreading through their veins. This wasn't just physical damage, it was a spiritual infection. Realizing this situation was far more catastrophic than anyone expected, the royal physician completely bypassed protocol and personally escorted the trembling soldiers directly to the throne room.
Now we have King Darren, sitting with his ministers discussing totally mundane matters of the kingdom, when the massive doors groan open. As the injured soldiers were dragged inside, the entire grand hall fell dead silent. Concern immediately washed over the king's face. "What happened? Where is Prince Jackson?" he demanded in a really heavy voice. The soldiers looked at one another nervously, shaking uncontrollably. "Your Majesty, there is something inside Shadowpine Forest." And then they revealed the horrors they had witnessed. They spoke of a mysterious black heart pulsing in the woods, an unnatural darkness that seemed to literally swallow the light, and a giant shadow creature of immense, unspeakable power. But the worst detail? Prince Jackson's brutal battle against it. They described how the creature defeated the prince effortlessly, physically separating his soul from his body and turning him into its eternal slave. As these words echoed, sheer terror slowly spread across the throne room. Ministers turned pale. Others stood entirely frozen in disbelief.
Imagine the mind of a father, who is also a king, trying to process this unimaginable loss. The exact moment King Darren realized his son, the heir to the throne, now belonged to this shadow creature, an explosive mix of grief and blinding rage filled his face. He didn't cower. He violently rose from his throne, his voice booming through the silent hall with a powerful, desperate command. "Then we march immediately. I will lead the full army into that forest and bring my son back myself." But before the king's orders could even be followed, an elderly minister quickly stepped forward, his expression totally grave. He lowered his voice to a hushed, cautious tone, warning the king that marching into Shadowpine would be a terrible mistake. Think about it. The Shadow had defeated the prince and elite soldiers without effort. A full army might never return. Instead, the minister brought up a buried secret from the kingdom's past. Years ago, a witch lived in the kingdom. She practiced dark magic and murdered innocents. The kingdom captured her, and she was ordered for execution. But the throne room grew completely silent as the minister reminded the king of his own past choice. At the last moment, the king had spared her life, exiling her instead. She was still alive, and if anyone knew anything about this ancient darkness, it would absolutely be her.
Without wasting another second, King Darren made his decision. Accompanied by his bravest royal soldiers, he traveled deep into the treacherous, uncharted mountains far beyond the kingdom's borders. And the journey was just macabre. For hours, they rode through dead, petrified forests. Freezing winds cut through their cloaks like ice. Finally, they reached a desolate, isolated clearing where a rotting cabin stood hidden between the dead trees. Strange, erratic black symbols were carved deeply into its wooden walls. Black candles burned outside the entrance, but their flames were completely motionless despite the wind. Even the air around the cabin felt heavy, unnatural, and completely suffocating.
As the king and his soldiers approached, the cabin door slowly creaked open all by itself. Standing inside the gloom was the old witch. Her long, stringy white hair covered most of her face, but her pale, entirely lifeless eyes immediately unsettled every single soldier present. She gave a slow, faint smile upon seeing the king. Darren stepped directly toward her, his voice tight. "I need your help to save my son." The witch stared at him silently for agonizingly long moments. Then, in a trembling, bone-chilling tone, she whispered, "So, the black heart has finally awakened." This right here is the grim, unforgiving reality of dark magic. King Darren desperately asked if she could save Prince Jackson. The witch thought quietly, then answered yes, but only under one horrific condition. Her voice suddenly became much colder. She demanded a human life. If the shadow attacked her while she performed the necessary ritual, she needed a living, breathing human shield to die in her place. The soldiers exchanged nervous, terrified glances. But King Darren, he didn't hesitate for a second. Deep within the kingdom's darkest prison sat a dangerous criminal, already sentenced to death. The king's ruthless solution was immediate. He ordered his men to ride back and retrieve the condemned man.
The ritual began the very next night. The soldiers returned with the prisoner chained tightly in heavy iron restraints. The criminal begged desperately for mercy, crying out into the dead woods, but nobody listened. King Darren personally handed the trembling man over to the witch. She led him into a hidden, pitch-black chamber within her cabin. The prisoner was dragged to the center and chained down. Step by step, the witch meticulously drew strange, glowing red symbols across the wooden floorboards, encircling him. Black candles were placed around the perimeter. Then, she closed her eyes and began to chant in a guttural, ancient language that sounded literally like grinding stones. Slowly, the air inside the small room became unbearably heavy. It felt as though the entire forest outside was pressing in, sensing the dark magic being violently pulled into reality.
The witch was trying to reach into the darkness to discover what the shadow creature truly wanted and where it was hiding the prince's soul. Then, without warning, every single candle inside the room went out at exactly the same time. A freezing, explosive wind ripped through the cabin, physically shaking the walls. The soldiers instantly drew their swords, the sound of steel ringing out in the dark as the shadows along the walls began twisting and moving unnaturally, detaching themselves from the corners of the room.
Within seconds, the temperature plummeted. From the absolute darkness of the room itself, the exact same gigantic shadow creature the soldiers had described emerged. It didn't just step into the room, it materialized, vast and suffocating. The elite royal guards, men who had fearlessly faced down invading armies, froze entirely in absolute, helpless terror.
But instead of attacking the witch, the towering entity ignored her entirely. It suddenly lunged toward the chained prisoner. The man began shrieking, a sound of pure, uncontrollable agony, as thick, black, smoke-like vines shot out from the creature and wrapped tightly around his thrashing body. Total chaos erupted as the shadow violently dragged the screaming man backward, pulling him into an abyss of darkness that seemed to open up within the very walls of the cabin itself. His desperate screams echoed and bounced off the walls of the cabin, and then, violently, they were cut short. Everything became silent again, a dead, suffocating silence. The creature had vanished just as quickly as it appeared, taking the sacrifice with it. King Darren stood absolutely frozen, his breath visible in the freezing air, shocked to his very core after witnessing the sheer, insurmountable power of the entity that had taken his son. The witch slowly turned her pale eyes toward the king, completely unbothered by the horror. "Now you understand," she whispered. "This is the true power of the shadow."
The king swallowed nervously, his previous rage entirely replaced by a creeping, icy dread. "Do you know anything else about it?" he pleaded. The witch remained silent for several long, agonizing seconds. Then she slowly turned her head toward the small window, looking out at the distant, jagged mountains silhouetted against the dark sky. "Yes," she spoke softly, her voice lingering in the cold air. "But now only one person can help you. Somewhere within your kingdom lives an old man, the oldest man in the entire land. He is dying, and he carries secrets older than the kingdom itself."
And that is exactly where this chapter of The Nightmare pauses.
We are left with a kingdom plunged into darkness, a prince without a soul, a king completely out of his depth, and a chilling final clue. Somewhere out there, clinging to his last breaths, is a man who holds the oldest, darkest secret in the land. So who is this dying man? And what ancient horrors does he remember that everyone else has forgotten? Thank you for walking into the dark with us in this explainer. The mystery is only deepening, and the true terror has only just begun to wake up. Stay vigilant. We'll uncover the next piece of the puzzle soon.